So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you're not following Think Fiveable on every possible media outlet, I don't know what you're doing with your life, check in with us and we will check in with you. So just really quickly, I'm going to tonight review the thesis and intro that Caroline talked about last week. If you missed it, I strongly recommend going and catching that replay. She really walked through thesis and intro. So after just really quickly go back into the thesis, talk about what a thesis should be and what it does, and then look into some prompt practice, talk about how to find the language that matters, how to create commentary, and then wrap it up and move on. So that's how this week will go. As usual, any questions you have, drop them in the chat, post them to the question, all of those things. And I will probably, like I just did, interrupt myself in the middle of a sentence. I get all distracted, but go ahead and drop that, any question that you have or anything you don't understand. So to review Caroline's great stream from last week, we know the thesis is going to establish the devices that are used to convey whatever they're asking. So we're talking this week about Q2, which is, yes, you're given a passage. It's going to be a prose passage, usually about a page, and you're going to have to analyze the passage in front of you. So the most basic thesis that we learn in English classes is basically in the text, the author uses blank, blank, blank to convey blank. The reason why we kind of sometimes want to establish that as the most basic is because sometimes what happens is with an AP prompt, you tend to just kind of repeat the prompt. I say parrot the prompt, and I have a little parrot that I put on my shoulder and walk around and and make parrot noises to my students when they've restated the prompt. And I say prompt, prompt, and they hate it. But you know, if the prompt tells you that there are devices used to convey a complex attitude, you want to make sure that you are using a thesis that establishes what the devices are and what the attitude is. And so sometimes when people are trying to put a thesis together, they just are like, oh, he uses devices to convey the attitude, which just parrots the prompt. So the flip side of that is if you turn it around, it gets a little more sophisticated. The author's use of devices conveys that blank. I believe, this is one of my favorite AP Lit kind of maxims to repeat, is that if you incorporate the word that into your thesis or theme statements every time, if you make sure there is the word that, then you're making sure that a whole idea follows that, and you're not going to parrot the prompt because the prompt doesn't give you a whole idea. So for example, instead of saying the author's use of simile and metaphor conveys a complex attitude, you would say the author's use of simile and metaphor convey that the character feels conflicted about the way, the beauty of the woman as well as his hatred for her. Or the author's use of simile and metaphor conveys that the two characters are committed to achieving their mission. However, they also are facing obstacles. So if you use the word that, if you make sure that there's a that in there, then you're establishing a defensible thesis, and that is going to get you your thesis point. So I just keep in mind, THAT, like get it in there and you will be more likely to establish a defensible thesis. You always want to make sure that in your thesis, you're including the complexity of the attitude or relationship or whatever you're asked to analyze. And so you want to, again, that the author's simile and metaphor convey that the relationship or attitude or whatever they ask you is blank yet blank. And then you have complexity. So we're going to look at that a little deeper in a moment and more specifically. So the word of this stream is specific because we're talking about evidence. And when we get into that evidence and commentary rubric, we know that they're looking for specific evidence and then a line of reasoning that is supported through the commentary. So we're going to leave that there. That's going to pop up a few times. The word of the stream is specific. So if I don't say it, you should be thinking it specific. So again, the rubric language, if you want to get 3 to 4 points in the evidence and commentary category, you're providing specific evidence to support all claims in a line of reasoning. And so if you caught my stream from a couple weeks ago with the prompt deconstruction, there was a line of reason, a big dark line of reasoning across some of the slides, because that line of reasoning is the thread that ties everything together. So you want to make sure that you establish your line of reasoning in your thesis, and that you are supporting that line of reasoning all through your commentary. And every piece of evidence is tied to the line of reasoning in that commentary. And so that's going to get you 3 to 4 points. The difference in the language between the 3 points and the 4 points is very similar. And so it just makes sure that you have specific evidence to support all claims in your line of reasoning. And that you haven't made claims in your thesis that aren't supported in your essay. So that's important too, that you make sure that everything that you put in there can be supportable. And sometimes you write yourself into a line of reasoning, which is fine. I definitely suggest that if you find that you have written yourself into ideas that you did not establish in your thesis, that you just go back and adjust that thesis. They're looking for a thesis somewhere. And so in the idea of the AP exam, the whole basis of the scoring is that you are writing a rough draft. They know you have 40 minutes. They're not expecting it to be beautiful, like on the paper beautiful. There, you should have, gone back a couple times and changed your mind or polished it. And so I think you want to have 2 to 3 points, 2 to 3 pieces, 2 to 3 devices. I want to make this very clear. You should have 2 to 3 devices in your thesis that are supportable to establish a line of reasoning. So I think that it's hard to say 4 or 5 paragraphs to answer Olivia's question. It's hard to say 4 or 5 paragraphs because I don't want you to get caught in the 5-paragraph format, right? But I also don't want you to not fully support your line of reasoning. But I have found very full essays that have 2, we call them big body paragraphs in my classes. We call big body paragraphs, they're robust paragraphs with insightful commentary. And it's better to support 2 ideas and tie them together through a line of reasoning than it is to have scanty, not insufficient paragraphs and have 3. So it's hard to say better. I think shooting for 3 is a good rule of thumb, but developing 2 strongly is going to be better than having 3 weak. So, or 4 week or however many. So, so 3 or 4 provide specific evidence, and then 2 points. Yes, I think so. You have your specific evidence, and your thesis is going to establish kind of how you're going to support them. And so 1 evidence per paragraph, I would say 1 sub idea per paragraph. And I'm going to go into that more specifically. It's like a, Kool-Aid drinking game. So I think more than 1 piece of evidence, but supporting 1 sub idea from your thesis. And so I would say line of reasoning, that's an excellent question. I would say line of reasoning is the big idea that is supported by your pieces of evidence. So if we look at these last 5 years of Q2 prompts, in blue is the element that you're analyzing. And this wording is going to be very similar. I think that 2017, you may have heard about the Peregrine Pickle prompt. Say that 3 times fast. But you may have heard about the Peregrine Pickle prompt, and it's a little bit different. But there's always write a well-developed essay or well-written essay, well-constructed essay. Like, they don't have to tell you that. That's the point, right? But in a well-constructed essay, analyze how the author blank. So how in 2015, how the author depicts the impact. 2016, Hardy's portrayal of the complex relationship. 2017, how the author explores the complex interplay. 2018, how Hawthorne portrays the narrator's attitude. 2019, how the author portrays the complex experience. And so all of that is, though, it's got a verb in there, it's got the author, the verb, and something that you're supposed to be breaking down. Of these last 5, you see that 3 of them include the word complex, but that word is always implied. You have to assume that on both the poetry and the prose essays, you are being asked to establish some complexity. So again, to say in your thesis that the experience or interplay or attitude is complex is not going to be defensible interpretation. You have to explain how, and that is going to establish your line of reasoning. So when you decide how that complexity occurs, when you decide that what the complexity is of the experience of the 2 sisters last year, that they were private yet interested in others, or however you've decided that it is, to establish that is going to establish your line of reasoning. And that's going to be that defensible interpretation that you need to be looking for evidence to support. So now that the rubric has changed from the highest being a 9 to the highest being a 6, it changes so it used to be kind of 4 and below is not passing. 5 was kind of, there was a middle. So we could say that 5 to 9 was the higher half. And now it's 4 to 6 is the higher half. So I think 4 is going to be passing-ish, because if you get, for example, your point for your thesis and 3 evidence points, I think that's going to be kind of the tipping point. Don't quote me because we haven't used this rubric on a real exam. And so I'm not sure how it's going to go, but I think that 4 is going to be the new 5. But it's going to be hard, I think, to determine until they get a set. And so we can establish, kind of that median, because we need scores to figure out where the average is. And then also, it's a little bit, I don't want to use statistics terms, but, it's not a straight cut, so the scores that lead to a 5 on the whole exam are going to be determined based on how students perform with this rubric. So, everybody's just kind of making some assumptions and going with what makes sense right now. It's going to be a very interesting year. I'm really interested in how that goes. So again, whatever that element is that you're supposed to be analyzing or breaking down, that how the author develops that is your line of reasoning. And so that all of your commentary circles back to that line of reasoning that you've established. So again, there's always going to be complexity. I can't say that enough. There's always going to be sides, facets, tension. That's how it goes. They're going to assume that you understand that and that you're looking for it. And so if you assume that it's there, whether the prompt has that word in it or not, then you can then read and annotate with that idea in mind that you are looking for. What are the sides? And that is how you can organize your essay. So going back to that question earlier about 4 or 5 paragraphs, if you have decided or you have interpreted that there is a shift in the passage that establishes the 2 complex sides or the 2 sides of the complexity, if you have a full-bodied paragraph with evidence and commentary that supports one side of the conflict or complexity, and then another full-bodied, insightful, analytical paragraph that explores the other side of the complexity, then you have a really well-written essay that will earn you all the points because you have specific evidence that connects to the line of reasoning, and you have commentary that connects the evidence to the line of reasoning. And so you have everything that they're looking for. And that's a good way to organize it. And that goes for poetry too. So that you can once you establish the complexity of the relationship character attitude, then if you explore both sides, if there are two sides, there could be 2 or 3 sides. But if you explore them both in a robust paragraph, then that you are pushing toward an evidence and commentary that is also then sophisticated. So there's going to be complexity regardless. It's going to help, once you figure out what it is, it's going to help you organize and write your essay, because you're going to, that's going to be the line of reasoning that you are exploring in each paragraph. Those are the two that's the way you break down your paragraphs. There's always going to be an abstract element in the prompt language that comes around that verb. So from the examples, analyze how the author portrays, depicts, explores, and then that whatever comes after that, the attitude, the relationship, the impact, the interplay. And if you go back further than the 5 years, you see this same basic frame that the author portrays, depicts, explores, establishes something, attitude, relationship, impact. And so anytime you're trying to practice anything you're reading, if you just take a couple pages, you can then figure out what's the complexity in these pages that I just read, and how would I describe that? How would I convey that? Or how does the author create it? And then that's prose analysis practice. And then the specific evidence, when you are reading, you're looking for that attitude, you're looking for the relationship, you're looking for the impact, you're looking for the interplay, and then you can figure out how it was established. Because the names of the devices don't matter unless they are creating evidence that connects to your line of reasoning. So there's a question about the best way to start a new body paragraph. Okay, I think there is a little bit of a formula. So if you have a formula for a thesis statement, and let me go back to that slide. If you have a formula for a thesis statement that says, for example, author, simile, and metaphor convey that the relationship is ending sadly. Sadly is a poor word, but that the relationship has bloomed through the obstacles. However, the obstacles took a toll on the characters. Then you have two sides, right? So you can talk about how it bloomed, and you can talk about the toll that the obstacles took. And that is if you take half of that thesis, then you have a little bit of a formula for a topic sentence, if that makes sense. So if you have simile and metaphor convey the relationship was blooming but is now dying, then your assertions or topic sentences are going to have simile and metaphor to establish the blooming of the relationship, and also simile and metaphor to establish the dying of the relationship, or however it works, right? It might be 7 similes to establish the blooming and 7 metaphors to establish the dying. It usually doesn't work out that way. And so I think that many times the easiest way to organize is by device, but the most effective way to organize is by the two sides of the complexity. Because if you organize by device, then you have, he had a simile about this that meant this, he had a simile about that that meant that, he had similes about dying roses, and it really just starts to sound formulaic. Whereas if your paragraph is about the blooming of the relationship, then you have interpreted that to be important, and you're describing the blooming of the relationship using his language as opposed to describing the language that he used. Somebody drop something in the chat if that didn't make sense, because I think it's a really important thing to remember, that organizing by devices is not as effective as organizing by idea, because the devices create the idea, not the other way around. Okay, so this is just an example of how you would annotate, right? So everything bold is something that everything bold is specific evidence. And so when we're talking about how specific is specific, right, you want to be as specific as possible, and that, that's obvious. But I think one thing that happens, and I don't know what your teachers have taught you, but I think one thing that happens is the quotes aren't specific enough. And so therefore, you tend to write about things that don't matter to your line of reasoning. And so I had a coworker who always insisted on no more than 5 words of evidence at a time, but I use a lot of words. And so I think the authors use a lot of words, and sometimes those words don't break off into five word pieces, but somewhere around there, I think, is where you want to make sure your evidence stops, because the more succinct it is, the more specific it is, and the more you're making sure that you are the one doing the analysis and that you're not either summarizing or letting the author do the work for you, because in this essay, you're the star, not the author. So this is a sample paragraph. The task was to analyze Clarence Hervey's complex character. And so just to read a little bit, the true nature of Hervey, although given the chance to shine through tone and point of view, see, that's the assertion there. And so this implies this was not the first paragraph. There was a paragraph about tone and point of view earlier with the other side of Hervey. So the previous paragraph was about how Hervey seems. And so that was the complexity, how he seems versus how he is. And so this is saying the true nature of Hervey really comes out in the language of the piece. Hervey has, quote, the desire of being thought superior in everything. He feels that, quote, he is entitled to be imprudent, wild, and eccentric. So there you establish that evidence. That's the most evidence in one sentence, because that's that first kind of proof, that first line of evidence. He is described as having a chameleon character, being able to adapt himself to any situation. We have interpretation of the evidence. He is also very worried about his image when the idea of marrying, quote, the niece of the catch matchmaker. And I think that is a specific piece of evidence, but is in quotes because it's not something that that person would say. Like if they had just said niece of the matchmaker, they wouldn't have had to quote it. Is being tossed about. He is filled with dread because he would have had to associate himself with someone his friends and he looked down on. So here we start to get into that commentary. The line of reasoning is about the complexity, about him being different than he appears. And so we're showing who he really is now. So the fear of losing image is even stronger than his desire for women. Hervey finds Belinda very beautiful, but because of her relatives, he was most inclined to despise her. And this is a little evidence dependent, but I'm showing it not to show necessarily great commentary, but to show great use of evidence. So I want to just throw that out there. But this is a very good balance, because if you were to highlight your evidence, you should definitely have more commentary than you have evidence. And if you were to redact your evidence, if you were to black it out, you really should still pretty much make sense. So that's kind of something to think about, that specific evidence is going to be short and to the point, and it's going to support your work, not do the work for you. To make a quick connection back to Lang, if you took Lang already, or you're going to, hi Natalie. If you think about like the synthesis essay, that the synthesis the sources support your essay, as opposed to you creating a argument based on the sources. It's like that. You don't want to let the evidence create your essay. You want the evidence to support your argument. Just a little Lang to lit connection. All right, so here we go. This is the prompt we're going to look at. Oh, it's already 8:27. This is the prompt we're going to work with a little bit. I'm going to show you the passage that goes with it, but I just want to show you the prompt first. So we have, again, that same format. The passage below is the opening of Sarah from the Sewanee, a novel written by Zora Neale Hurston. Read the passage carefully, then write a well-organized essay in which you analyze the literary techniques Hurston uses to describe Sawley and characterize the people who live there. So what is the structural, topical, thematical, abstract element? That's a lot of words to just cover all the options. What is the element that you are analyzing? Anyone, drop it in the chat. What's the element that you're analyzing? While you are reading and thinking, I'm going to look at these questions. Yes, they're rolling in now. Characterization. And this is a double. This is a twofer, right? Yeah, so analyzing the characters, but also how she uses techniques to do what other thing? Yes, Rebecca, to describe. Right, so we're looking at, we are now knowing that we have to look for two different things, which is not likely to happen, but is a good challenge. So we're looking for literary techniques. We know we're looking for that. And actually, this wasn't from an older prompt where some literary techniques were given, but I took that off because that's not something that's going to happen anymore. So from 2020 on, they're not going to offer any sample techniques, right? So some people get caught up in them. Some people rely on them. Some people feel like they're the only things that are options, and none of that's true. So they're not going to give them anymore. So we'll say something like this: the literary techniques uses to, yes, describe Solly, whatever Solly is, we don't really know yet, whatever Solly is, and the people who live there. I mean, obviously we can kind of infer that Solly's a place. So describe Solly and characterize the people who live there. And that's going to be important because now we're thinking, why these two things? So we're going into the prompt knowing that there are two things that we're looking for and that there's going to be some sort of complexity in there. Either the town's going to be complex, or the town versus the people is going to be complex, or the people are going to be complex. Something is going to have some conflict. Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. We should always read the question first. We should never, ever, 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 ever assume that we know everything that what we're going to be asked, or the essay that we're going to write. And I think read the question first, because the question will help you look. The question tells you what you're looking for. You don't want to just read it. You don't have time. Like, you literally don't have time to just read the passage for joy and find what you find. You don't. What you have time for is to read the passage with purpose. And the purpose is going to be found in the prompt. So thank you. That's a great question. So we are now knowing. So, and there are also some background pieces in there that are going to be important. Yes, exactly, Rebecca. So there are some background pieces. We know that it's written by Zora Neale Hurston. Maybe we've read Their Eyes Are Watching God. Maybe we haven't, but we know that it's in 1948. And we know something about, we know post-war, we know recovery. We might know something about 1948, but we know that it's not 1848, and we know that it's not 2019. So we have a general idea about what's going on in 1948, what a town might look like in 1948. We just can think about that. And if you know anything about the Sewanee, maybe you are from the South, or maybe you have looked at Stephen Foster, whatever. It's a Southern river. And so some of these things, depending on how much you know, and it's fine if you don't, but if you do, it helps, right? So it already establishes that we're looking at some sort of Southern country, Southern area, Southern city, town, whatever. Also, if you know anything about Zora Neale Hurston, it's almost always, her things are almost always set in the South. So I think how many literary devices, Natalie, that we look for is going to be based on how many we find. I think there's no reason to assume that we're going to find 3 or 4 that matter. So is it beneficial to start learning and recognizing? I think the basics you already know from just having been in high school, metaphors, similes, whatever, but more important is what they do, right? Metaphors and similes compare something figuratively. Allusions make references. And so if you talk about what's happening rather than name it, you're fine. If you say metaphor to compare blank, because we're always talking about function anyway, if you say she compares blank and blank in this metaphor, that's just as powerful as she compares this to that. So I think we're not going to worry about how many devices. We're going to wait until we see how many devices. We're not going to necessarily worry about what they're called, because we need to know more what they do. So if you want to memorize some terms, then I welcome you to do so, but it doesn't make you more sophisticated, and it doesn't make you more effective. It just gives you a name to something, because it's really the difference between saying Candace Moore and the woman who did the live stream. You know what I mean? Like, they're the same. So if you don't know my name, you can describe me, right? So it's fine. I think either way works. If you have the terms in your head, then use them. If you don't, describe them. And actually, to describe them without the word means you're going to describe it even better, which is going to make for stronger commentary. So I think that's, and then what are the best devices to use? I think the best devices to write about are the devices that establish the complexity. Like, I don't really know how else to say that. Like, you can't, on the prose and poetry analysis questions, you can't go in with any assumptions. You can't assume that there will be metaphors. You can't assume that there will be imagery. You can't assume anything. You just have to look for it, and you have to find it by looking for the abstract element. So I think when I was talking about, there's a question here. Do you think that being a little too cookie cutter will affect the grade on the essay? I think it's a very fine line. I think in some ways, to be able to fit your words and analysis into templates or formats that you already have in your head is going to be comforting and maybe make you more confident. I also think that the way that the rubric works now, if you have a thesis, no matter how cookie cutter it is, if you have a thesis that gives a defensible interpretation, you're going to get a thesis point. And if you have evidence and commentary that is specific and relevant and supports a line of reasoning, all of your claims support a line of reasoning, then you're going to get your evidence and commentary points. I think that now cookie cutter is going to prevent you from getting a sophistication point. And so going back to the previous thought about like kind of what's the high, what's the passing. If you get all of your evidence and commentary points and all of your thesis points, then you are still doing well without a sophistication point. So I think it just depends on how well you can support. So I think being too cookie cutter obviously is not a good choice. Like if it seems like you just plugged devices and analysis into an essay that you have been writing 17 times in class, then that's going to be obvious. It's going to be obvious that you're not, number one, you're not sophisticated, but also that your analysis is not thorough. Like it's not, insightful. So I think to be too cookie cutter, yes, will affect your grade. But I think to have an organizational format that you use is probably not going to hurt you unless you don't know. It's kind of like, some people are minimalists with like decor. Some people just want a clean line in their home, and they have a TV stand and a couch and a chair, and that does it. Like technically, that's the format for a living room. I like a bunch of stuff, so I want pictures on the wall, and I want things to be colorful. So would my decor get a better grade? No, because it's doing the function of a living room. So that's a kind of weird analogy, but I think your style is going to determine what's cookie cutter and what's not. And so how you get your line of reasoning across and how well you support it is going to be what's important, not necessarily if it's organized the way that everybody else organizes it. Because you have 40 minutes, right? This is a rough draft. And so you're going to do what you've practiced, and you're going to do it as well as you can, right? And so what you would have done if you had time to go back and revise is a completely different standard. Okay, so, I'm going to get to that question. So I'm going to come back to that. All right, so let's look at the passage that goes with this, and then I'm going to come back to the questions. So we said that the abstract element is, here we go, describe Solly and characterize the people who live there. So in the interest of time, because boy, did this fly, I'm going to read the parts of the passage that I'm going to use in my example. So we're looking for the techniques Hurston uses to describe Solly and characterize the people who live there. And so again, we need to have an understanding of both the town and the people. And also, I hope you can see pretty well. So Solly, the town, is in West Florida, on the famous Suwannee River. It is flanked on the south by the curving course of the river, which Stephen Foster made famous without ever having looked upon its waters. running swift and deep through the primitive forests and reddened by the chemicals leached out of drinking roots. On the north, the town is flanked by cultivated fields planted to corn, cane, potatoes, tobacco, and small patches of cotton. So we get introduced to Sali here. We're looking for techniques used to describe it, and the people, and characterize the people who live there. So we have a description here a little bit. We know that it's on a river. We know that it's flanked by cultivated fields, which is a little bit important. Yes. So thank you, Julia. If you are running out of time, I think that there's no way to avoid reading the description. I think whatever College Board has decided to give to you about the passage, you should use it. You should take it into consideration, because it's going to prep you. It's going to actually cut down on time. It's like the investment of 5 seconds is going to buy you a better essay, because it's going to help you discard things that you don't need. Because if you say, okay, so if, for example, if that had been a very vivid description of the town just above it in Georgia, like maybe it's on the Florida-Georgia line, that could have been a very vivid description of the town in Georgia, but it's not useful, because we're looking for, good question, Ali, we're looking for Sali and the people in it. This second paragraph, and I want to dive into this because it's going to start us understanding why the prompt is the way that it is. And so again, we're only looking for two things. We're only looking for Sali and the people. Okay. And really that first paragraph is more about the river than it is about the town. Ho, okay, don't get caught up. However, few of these fields were intensely cultivated. Oh, wait, we thought they were cultivated. Few of them are intensively cultivated. For the most part, they were scratchy plantings, the people being mostly occupied in the production of turpentine and lumber. Sali is a town that used to be one thing and isn't anymore. So it used to be a farming town, but now people are making turpentine and lumber. Complexity, right? Woo, look. So we found this because we were looking for it. The life of Sali streamed out from the sawmill and the turpentine still. That's in quotes, because that's how the people in Florida say turpentine. Characterization. Then, too, there was ignorance and poverty and the ever-present hookworm. The farms and scanty flowers in front yards and in tin cans and buckets looked like the people. Trees and plants always look like the people they live with somehow. Okay, so we're getting into why the prompt asks us to not only describe the town. I'm not only looking for the techniques to describe the town, but also the people who live there, because she brings them together. So she goes on and talks about what it used to be. And then she says, few were concerned with the past. They had heard that the stubbornly resisting Indians had been there, ... Because I'm going to pull this out. I strongly recommend that if you feel like playing with this, you come back and read it slower. Few were concerned with the past, ... Few knew and nobody cared that the Hidalgos under De Soto had moved westward. The people thought no more of them than they did the magnolias and bay and other ornamental trees which grew so plentifully in the swamps. Sorry, I'm on the right side at line 44. Other ornamental trees which grew so plentifully in the swamps along the river, nor the fame of the stream. They don't care. They don't care that some of their plants are scanty. They don't care that these beautiful magnolias are grown. They don't look at the town that way, which implies that somebody does, right? In this time, in 1948-ish, people are coming in and they're like, oh, the beautiful magnolias, but the people aren't looking at that. They care. So 46, they didn't know about that. They knew that there were plenty of black bass, locally known as trout, in the Suwannee, and bream and perch and catfish. Okay, so Rebecca, I think it's hard to skim. It's very difficult to skim because you don't know what it is unless you read it, right? So if we know what we're looking for because we're looking for that element, we kind of have to read it, but we have to be looking very closely when it starts to dive into the people or the town. So it's hard to say where you should focus the most. You should be looking for what establishes the element that you're being asked. And so, yes, it seems like you would be able to find keywords. So for example, if you, and this is going to answer Anna's question a little bit too about what if you read the poem and you don't really understand it. If it tells you that you're looking to analyze a character, then you're going to be able to focus in on the character's names and the character's pronouns, right? And so that helps. And so, for example, in this second column, this is all about the people and what they know, right? But you need to know the words that are used in order to know what the characterization is. So it's tough. It's tough to say this is what to do to skim, but it's also tough to say this is what to look for, because really you're looking for those pieces. And so this is a question: how do you recommend we write the FRQ without doing plot summary? I think that the plot summary comes when you don't really know what happened. So those kind of go together, your two questions. But I think the plot summary, the facts of the plot, this is what I'm trying to say. The facts of the plot are only important as to how much they establish the element that you're analyzing. So what happened in the prose passage, and so yes, Lucy, it's only prose. What happened in the prose passage is only important if it helps to support your line of reasoning about the town of Solly and the characterization of the people who live there. So you don't have to say that she describes the town of Solly and that she goes into, goes into historical background unless it matters for how they're characterized. So you don't want to use plot summary because you're only using those pieces that matter, because you're only using pieces that are the devices that you found when you were looking for the element. And so it kind of goes like this, because you've figured out this is the big thing that I'm looking for, these two things here, right? The town of Solly and the people who live there. Well, how does she tell me about the town of Solly and the people who live there? She describes it. She goes into history. She talks about what they value. Those are the devices. And going back to what if you don't know the devices? You don't have to, because you know she describes, you know she goes into history, and you know she compares the people to the plants, right? And those are the only things that matter. So another question was, what would be the best course of action if you lack any specific evidence related to your thesis in the middle of your essay? I think what you're saying is you've established a line of reasoning, you've made a claim, and then you find that you don't really have the evidence to support that. If I've misread that, Santiago, please correct me. But I think you don't write the thesis until you know what you're going to say. So again, if you're looking for complexity, we've now found that the people of Solly they're scant and scratchy like the plants, but they also have these values about the fish in the stream and the turtles that you can eat. And so they have values that aren't the same as everyone else's, but they know what's important to them. And so if that's your thesis, which it's about to be, if that's your thesis, then you don't end up lacking evidence, because that's what you found in the passage, and you're going to use those to do it. So I want to go into kind of what I found, because it's going to help me answer some of these remaining questions. So these two pieces, these two boxes, right, are the two things that I've found. They're what I'm not saying at all, I'm not recommending that you write them. This would be what I would underline or circle as I was reading. So these would be my annotations. I just typed them up so that you could see them next to each other. And so we have flanked by cultivated fields, not all were intensively cultivated, and that's a versus, there's complexity. Scratchy plantings, ignorance and poverty, and this is the town of Solly. And then on this people side, we have what they value, we have what they don't, and so what they see and what they care about versus what they're expected to see, or maybe what other people see. So it's difficult to talk about the sophistication point for the prose analysis. I think that the The sophistication is going to come from the way you write. Going back to that idea about cookie cutter, the farther you are from a template, the more likely you are. And also, if you place the passage in a broader kind of thematic context. So if you start to think about, okay, 1948, people were starting to move around, people are moving around the country, they're reviving economy from the war, that kind of thing. And you start to think about the change and whether or not these people value history or they value everyday life. So then we start to think about, what does that mean for the country? Where does that set us in the greater context of U.S. history kind of thing? And also, what does that mean for small town people? And so if you take that bigger and you kind of think about how people tend to value what's important to them, right? They don't place value on things that, for like the magnolia trees. They didn't care about the magnolia trees as much as somebody expected them to, or somebody coming in might. Then sophistication comes from complexity and it comes from the greater context. And so if you can make it thematic when it hasn't asked you to, I think that lends to sophistication. If your topic sentences don't have, if they don't sound just alike, right? So the way that I told you to format them, if you can go past that and kind of add, if you're strong in your transitions and your style, I think that's where the sophistication is going to come in. So there are two questions that kind of go together. Lucy's asking, can we use a device that's used only one time? And then there was a question earlier, how many pieces of evidence do you recommend we use? I think that, yes, Lucy, you can use a device that's used only one time, because you're not trying to figure out how prevalent or how dominant the device is. You're really looking for how well it creates the complexity or the piece of complexity that you're talking about. So if there's one metaphor, but it very strongly characterizes the people of Sully, then absolutely you can use that metaphor. And you don't have to put it in your thesis, because your thesis is far more important about what you're establishing than it is about the techniques. Because you're going to mention techniques, but you don't have to name every technique that's used. And you also don't have to even name it in the paragraph. So if you found this really important metaphor, it's just support for your line of reasoning. Like, I can't take line of reasoning enough, but also specific being the word of the stream. If you have found that piece of evidence that is most specific and relevant to the point that you're making, then definitely use it, because it's going to ground your commentary. Okay, so I have a thesis that I came up with. So I was going to have you write one, but we are running out of time. You have asked great questions, and I hope that I have answered them well. I hope that this is useful to you and that you are growing as we speak. But here's my thesis. And again, we're looking for the complexity. We're looking for, and that just is a but or yet. Like, really, if you have a but or yet in your thesis, sometimes even an and, that's what I have, is an and. Then you've had some complexity. So we're looking to make sure that we establish complexity. We're looking to make sure that we establish a line of reasoning. And we're looking to make sure that we've referred to those two things that were asked about, the town of Sully and the people who live there. So I say Hurston's dispirited comparisons, see, I didn't say metaphor, of the people and crops of Sully, as well as her repetition in historical references, characterize the town of Sully and its people as a hard-scrabbled group with priorities that do not match their perception. So it's a lot. It's a kind of long sentence. But one of the reasons why it's long is because we had to talk about two different things. So that's going to add to the analysis that we need to establish. And notice that there is no evidence in there. I said repetition and historical references that aren't allusions, because she doesn't allude, she describes. But to make sure that I know that I put an adjective in there. And I think that's one of the things that's going to push your thesis. And thesis is only a point or not, But if I had just said she uses techniques to characterize them, then I'm not saying anything at all. If I had said she uses metaphors to characterize them, then I'm saying a little bit. But if I say she uses this kind of metaphor to characterize them as this and this, then I have complexity, I have sophistication. So you want to push to make sure that even if you use words like metaphor and simile, that you have a description of them or an implication of what they compare. So, you know, if the passage is about dying flowers, then you might say floral metaphors. Like, it doesn't have to be that deep. It just has to show that you know what you're talking about, that you actually read the passage and that you're prepared to analyze it. Okay, so, oh gosh. So commentary, again, in the language of the rubric, a 4 is going to consistently explain how the evidence supports the line of reasoning, and also explain how multiple literary elements in the poem contribute to its meaning. So again, going back to that question before about if something's important, can we use it? Yes, right? But if it only happens once, then you have to make sure that you have a robust amount of other evidence, because again, we are looking at complexity and also this idea of sophistication, that you are looking at how multiple things are used by the author, because they're great, right? The authors are good at this. So they're not going to rely on one device or element to establish this complex abstract idea. So they're going to make sure that the authors are going to make sure that they make these choices for you, like that they show what the choices are, and you're just analyzing the choices. They're like, they decided to do this. You don't have to in Q2 connect the author's idea to a broader context, but you don't have to for evidence and commentary, right? But that's going to push into sophistication. Not as much as Q3. Like Q3, you have to make sure that you're addressing the thematic meaning. But I think that's sophistication that's one of the points of sophistication, that you're kind of trying to say how this specific thing is important to the world. So again, making sure in your commentary that you are both specific and relevant. And so this paragraph, Zora Neale Hurston compares the town's trees and flowers to the people of the town. That's a assertion, but it doesn't say anything. It's not an interpretation, right? It just says this is a comparison that happens in paragraph 2, and then it tells yes, exactly, Anna. It tells what she says and what it implies, right? So in that second sentence, stating people in the town were poor and dingy, that's an interpretation, but that piece of interpretation should have been present in your assertion. Like, you want to make sure that that you are establishing what you're going to analyze. And so it doesn't really give commentary, because it doesn't tell why it matters. Like, it doesn't establish a line of reasoning. It doesn't support a line of reasoning. It just says this is what she does, and this is what that means. Right? So you want to make sure that you're answering so what. Sometimes I write that on paper. So what? And my students are like, that's rude. And it is academically rude. I'll take that. But you have to answer so what. You have to tell me why this matters. Like, why is this metaphor? Why is this metaphor being used? Why is she comparing people to flowers? And why are they both scanty? So if I'm looking for the evidence that matters from those 2 lists that I had, these are the things that are going to push into what I need and what I know. So it's 8:58. That was way more evidence than commentary, but I do think that the evidence matters. Like, how you choose the evidence is going to establish how strong your commentary is. And so I might come back and fit into one of those places where there isn't one, maybe on the 23rd, where there isn't a stream right now. But I think the commentary is why you chose that evidence always, right? And so if you have, in order, read the prompt, figured out exactly what the prompt is asking you, made sure that you've read any information about the text that they give, and then read the actual passage with that prompt in mind, This is the element that I'm looking for, period. Right? I don't care about anything but the town and the people. That's all I care about. I'm analyzing characterization because really she characterizes this town by characterizing the people. Yes, thank you, Arlene. Right, period. So I have read the prompt so that I know what to look for. And as closely as I can skim, right, as much as it's possible to skim, I've skimmed because I'm only paying attention to the town and the characterization of the people. And then once I've found those pieces, then I can look and say, okay, I know what device that is. I know what device that is. Because devices are just choices. They're tools, right? Literally, a device. So it's a tool to create that abstract element. And so I only care about what's created. And then I go back. It's like art, right? You look at the art and it's beautiful. And then you're saying, oh, how'd they make that? Right? And then you can say, okay, well, these are the brush strokes and this is the collage pieces or whatever it is, right? This is how you're looking at this text, as though you have looked at it from afar, then you've gotten up closer and you can like read, right? Your tarot reading, I mean, not tarot reading, but your palm reading. You have to start with this element that they've given you. And that's all you care about. You've got tunnel vision on that element. And so that's going to give you the devices, because you can't just look for devices, because then they won't make sense. And then you'll have a disorganized or summary. You either have a disorganized essay or an essay that's just summary, or it's just pieces. It's just that paragraph that we just looked at. It's just, interpretation. We don't only need interpretation. We need that interpretation to fit together to develop a line of reasoning that goes from top to bottom. Okay. So I hope that is helpful. I did a lot of talking, but you guys were asking really good questions. And I think, so many people's questions kind of fit together that I hope that you had questions answered that you didn't even ask, that you had them. So thank you so much for joining me. I don't know if the coronavirus roundtable is still happening, but check that out too. Laura Walton will be here next week. Thank you so much for coming and participating. Have a great Monday evening.